Hello everyone, and thanks for joining me again. Today we're going to build a responsive sidebar with React hooks. If you're fairly comfortable with vanilla JavaScript and you know how to manipulate the DOM using that, then you can probably build something like this fairly easily, but if you're new to React and in particular to React hooks, it might be a little bit more challenging. For example, if you were to use a toggle button to bring that sidebar onto the page, and then to take it off the page again upon clicking it, then you would use state in React to make that happen. And before we go any further, I'll have to apologize for some of the background noise you might hear. I'm in Tokyo, Japan, and I think there's a typhoon rolling in now. I can't be sure, so you might hear some howling wind. And you'll probably hear the cacophony of cicadas in the background as well. We're in the dog days of summer here, so that's just kind of par for the course when you live in Tokyo and in Japan in general. Anyway, let's get started. So I've provided a link to the repository for this tutorial. All right, you can find it at this URL. It's in my GitHub. So that link will be in the description below. Once you go there, clone the repository. And if you haven't cloned a repository before, you just click clone or download, copy the link, go into your editor of choice, and then go into the directory that you want to create this project in. And then go ahead and clone the repository, or do git clone. Paste in that link, and then call the project whatever you want to call it. I'll just call it my app. Alright, seems like, because I've already done one attempt at this this project before, I've already created the my app package, so I'll have to go in there and delete that. Sorry, the my app project. Sorry about this, it'll take just a couple of seconds. Alright, it's gone. Let's try this again. Do git clone, paste in that URL, give it a title of whatever you want to give it, call it my app, and let's try this again. Okay, so we've brought it in, or we've at least got it locally now. Now we just need to bring it into our workspace. Take a look at the package.json folder. You can see there are three dependencies, our Gatsby, React, and React DOM. Now if you have not used Gatsby before, don't worry, I've already done the bulk of the work for you. The main thing is when you run your dev server, you'll be using a command, Gatsby develop. So before we do that, let's go ahead and install these packages. So you'll have to navigate into your project. Alright, do an install. Okay, now you should be able to run your dev server and see something at localhost 8000. Localhost 8000 is where is the kind of default place, that the default browser tab that Gatsby opens up for you and lets you see your project when you're in dev mode. So you go to localhost 8000, you should see this. And if you look over here at the sidebar, you can see that there are some elements on the main page that are underneath it. All right, and the sidebar is permanently open. I can't close it. And if you open up these few files, layout, sidebar, toggle, and componentstyles.css, go into componentstyles.css and you'll find a selector for sidebar. And that's because in my sidebar component, I've given it a class of sidebar. Alright, and you can see that I've set the opacity to 0.8. That way, you can actually see these elements underneath the sidebar. And if you look closely up here at the top, you'll see a toggle button, a little hamburger. Okay, but we can't close it right now. And we don't want the sidebar permanently open like this, so let's do something right now to take it off the screen. What you can do, see, I've set the sidebar, given it a position of fixed, and given it a z-index of 200 to keep it floating above the rest of the main page content. What we can do is we can set the property left to minus 100%. All right, and that'll just take it completely off the page. As you see here, it sets the left side of the sidebar component all the way at a negative 100%, which means way off the page. If you were to set it to 0 instead, then it would set the left side of that sidebar component to the left side of your screen, which is right here, and that would bring the sidebar onto the page. But let's not do that. Okay, let's keep it off the page for now. And then maybe we want to bring it in by sliding it in, not just popping it onto the screen. So we can use a CSS animation. And we'll call that slide open. We'll let it take place for a duration of about half a second. All right, and to make it work, we'll need to use keyframes. Remember, we called this slide open. And you can give it whatever title you want. All right, and we'll say that when the process of sliding is 100% complete, then we'll set the left side of the sidebar component to 0, which, as you recall, should make it on the page. That left side of the sidebar component should be at the left edge of your screen. All right, so you see it's back on your page now, and if you refresh, it slides in. Maybe it slides in too fast for your liking. You want to slow it down a little bit. You can do that just by changing the duration here, and we'll just say 0.75. All right, refresh the page, and it slides in a little bit slower. All right. If you want to slide in really slowly, you can just say 2 seconds. Right. Okay, that's a little bit too slow, of course. So we'll just put it back at 0.75. But we don't want it to just slide in on page load and stay there. We want to be able to click this close button and get it off the screen. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to go into our layout component. All right, and we're going to use state to do that. And remember, we're not building class components here. We're building functional components. All right, so in that way, we're not going to use this.setState to manage our state. We're going to use React hooks. Right, in particular, we're going to use state to set up our state variables. So we'll call our first state variable sidebar open. Right, it'll be a Boolean variable. That means it'll have either true or false values. So we'll set it up this way. Call it sidebar open. And then to set the state, we need also set sidebar open. Now you see that all we're doing is we're prepending the word set to sidebar open. But one thing you have to be careful of, because we're using camel case, is to make this S an uppercase S here. All right, and then you initialize it using useState, and we're setting it initially to false. All right, so we have that, and we need a method that does something for us here. It toggles between open and not open. So we'll define a method here. We'll call it open handler. And we'll say that if the sidebar isn't open, so we'll say that we'll set the sidebar open to true to make it open. Otherwise, if it is already open, sorry, don't know what I was thinking there. Sometimes talking and coding for me is dangerous. But otherwise, if it's not open, then we will set it to false. Okay, so that's there. And what we'll want to do is we'll want to make this happen on click of a button. But first, before we do that, I'd like you to go ahead and look at your screen. All right, you see the sidebar is still there. All right, now go down to the toggle component. What this is this is a toggle button as a component that we've created here. All right, and we want to pass a prop to it, right? And that's going to be the function open handler. So let's just call the prop click. All right, and we'll pass it open handler as a prop, or sorry, as an argument. So basically, it will send this function into the toggle component, and since we're passing it in as props, we'll have to define them there, or let it know that we're doing that. And then we'll say that this button, excuse me, we'll say that on click, this should just equal props.click, right? Because we called the prop click here, and click refers to this method open handler up here. Okay. One other thing we should do is we should remove the sidebar component here, and let's turn it into a variable, because what we're going to do is we're actually going to change the class dynamically. So that, for example, right now the sidebar has a class of sidebar, the main div that wraps the component. And if you go in here, you see our selector for sidebar. And this is what we're using to make our sidebar visible or not visible, for example. All right, but what we'd like to do is like to create another class, right? And for now, just if you don't know what we're doing, just follow along. We use .sidebar.close, and we'll say that basically, if the sidebar class is this, we want the sidebar to be off the screen. All right, so what we can do is we can say left should be negative 100%. All right, and for now, we'll leave it there. Okay, so go back to your layout, and let's create a variable called sidebar. Let's turn our component into a variable. So we'll define it. We'll say let sidebar, and we'll say that if the sidebar is open, then what we'll do is we'll define, or we'll let sidebar be the actual component. Right, and we'll give it a class of sidebar. But first, let's just leave it here. So now what we're saying is that, oh, sorry, also what we should do is replace this with the component variable that we just created here. Okay, now, what we're saying is if the sidebar open variable is true, then we will get this component rendered. And if it's not true, we shouldn't see it. Now remember, initially we set sidebar open to false, so that means if we look at our page, we should not see the sidebar. And indeed we don't. We still don't have any functionality on that top. Whoa, what happened there? Ah, I see. Sorry, I made myself look foolish there. Basically, if we refresh the page, we should not see the sidebar, right? But once you click that toggle button, it is going to call the open click handler, and it's going to do something. But before we do that, we want to more skillfully manage state so that we don't just have it pop onto the screen without the ability to remove it. Like I said, I showed you here, if I click this toggle button, it pops onto the screen, but we can't close it. Right, so when we click the toggle button, right here, props.click on click, then we go to our layout and we see that that click refers to the open handler method up here, and that sets sidebar open to true, and that's going to actually bring in our sidebar. Alright, so that's why it's working that way, but we can't get it off the screen yet. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to be able to hit this close button and close the sidebar. So we need to go look at our sidebar component, and you can see that button is right here. Alright, we would like to include an onClick method. Alright. we would like some function that closes the sidebar, right? And we'll call this close click. Let's just call it close handler. Right? Now we've called it here, but we haven't defined it yet, so we'll need to go up here and define it. All right. And what we're going to use is we're going to use another state variable that manages the sidebar's class, like what class it's going to have. Currently, when it's open, it has the sidebar class, right? It's using this here to make it behave in the way that this tells it to behave. And if it's closed, it'll follow this. Right, so what we need to do is we need to initially give it the class of sidebar, right here, not this one here. We want it to change to this when we click that close button. Right, so what we can do is in our layout, we can pass a prop, and we'll just call it sidebar. You can call it anything you like. And this is going to be for passing the class into the sidebar component. So initially we're just setting it to sidebar, right? Just like you saw here, okay? But this is not a variable right now, so nothing's happening. But we pass that in as a prop here, and then if we go to sidebar and we receive the props, then what we can do is we can define a state variable, and let's call it sidebar class. And we set it using set sidebar class. And what we'll do is we'll initialize it to the class that gets passed in here, right? But before we do that, we'll have to bring in useState from React, because we're using hooks now. And now we can use useState here. Right, and we'll set this initially to props.sidebar, right, which is going to give it this value here. Excuse me. But we also need to make this a variable that matches up. All right, and we'll just call this sidebar class. Okay, so now we're giving it the class of sidebar, but we're doing it through the use of this variable. We're doing it through props. Okay, so if we look at our screen, all right, we see that right now this sidebar class should be set to false as we've set it up. We initialized it that way here. Okay, so go back to your sidebar and let's define this method now called close handler. Excuse me. Alright, what are we going to do with this? Right, we're going to say, well, just as a matter of practice, do this. Use e.prevent default to make sure no default behavior happens. We can manage things our way. Right, and then what we want to do is we want to set the sidebar class to, in this case, either true or false, right? It just depends. Since we're closing it, right, we want the sidebar to be closed. Okay, so we'll say set sidebar class, and then now we'll say sidebar, and then we'll add close. All right, and that will make sure that we use this here. Okay? So let's see what happens when we click the buttons now. So if we click this, we bring in the sidebar. If we click close, nothing happens yet. Alright, so we have to make sure that we actually set the sidebar to false, right? It's not going to pass this in yet. So what we'll do is we'll say here, we'll call the function click. Sorry, close, excuse me. Alright, so we need to set the sidebar open value to false, right, by using this method. Now this method, you might be wondering where it comes from. Well, we haven't created it yet. So what we can do is go back to layout, and remember, we're going to pass this in as props here into the sidebar. So if you go into layout and you go into your sidebar component, create a prop called close, and let's set that equal to, and we'll call this close handler. This is, we're repeating the names of our methods here, and that's probably not good practice. So let's call it sidebar close handler. All right, and then we can define that method right here underneath the open handler. Right, and we can just basically say set sidebar open to false, right, because we want to close it. Right, now it should work. If we click close, it goes away. Good. Right, but it doesn't go away in a way that we would like it to. It slides in nicely, but it doesn't close nicely. So we want to slide off the screen. So this is basically just a matter of tweaking the CSS at this point. We can go into our component styles and we can say create an animation here. And we'll call this slide closed. And we'll give it a duration of, let's just say, a second. Alright, and we'll use a keyframe for that as well. Good. Alright, and then we'll say at 100%, this should be negative 100%. Means when the sliding process is done, it'll be off the screen, right? Which means we need to give it an initial value of 0. That's where it'll be when the sidebar is open. Okay, so let's go ahead and open our sidebar and then try to close it. So you can see that it's just popping off the screen. It's not doing what we want. Right? But there's a way to fix that. Right, so if you go into your sidebar component and just don't delete this, just cut it, hold on to it, and then we'll use a set timeout method. And then we'll call that function. And let's just say after 1 second. Alright, go back here, open, slides in, close, it slides off. Okay, so that's it. You have a responsive sidebar using React hooks, and you did it by using state to manage whether or not the sidebar should be visible or not visible. So I hope this was just a nice little introduction to how to use React hooks to do something that you may do normally just using vanilla JavaScript. And maybe in the future we'll do other hooks tutorials, but for now I hope this was a good introduction to it for you. Anyway, thank you as always for joining me, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers.